Welcome to Secret Story. Sophie had been disappointed not to have had a little fun with Brian earlier, but she had loved the house. She waited impatiently for Mike to get home. She was glad the Wilsons trusted her with the keys and could not wait to impress Mike with the house. Sophie's mum dropped the twins back home shortly before Mike arrived. Sophie had already changed back into jeans. Do you want to go and see the house? We can take the twins, too. I have the keys. Sophie was surprised at how excited she sounded. Mike complained about the traffic and a headache, and they agreed to go in the morning. Saturday was bright and sunny, and Mike agreed to drive them all as long as they were back for the big game on TV that afternoon. Mike could not help but get excited about the house and moving. The house was better than he expected, though the immaculate large garden worried him a little. All the way home, Sophie and Mike made plans, talked about decorating, and agreed they should move. They also hoped to be in by the end of the month. Just 3 weeks away. Monday came, and Sophie went and told Brian and his wife they would love to move into the house. Brian's wife asked her to call her Mildred and hoped they would be happy. Brian said they could move whenever they wanted to, and Sophie said they hoped to do it by the end of the month. Mildred bustled around, serving tea and delicious homemade cakes. Afterwards, Brian offered to drive Sophie home. On the way, he asked if he could help with the move. Sophie said Mike would try to borrow a van from work and some friends to help with lifting. She said she could get all the boxes she needed from work and thought they would be okay. Brian apologized that he could not come in as he dropped Sophie home. Enjoy these, and thank you again for the chance to move. Bring them back next time you see me. Sophie kissed him on the cheek before she walked to the front door and waved as Brian drove away. On Wednesday afternoon, rent day, Sophie was delighted to see Brian and Jeffrey standing on her doorstep. They followed her into the kitchen, both offering help with her house move. Jeffrey said he could arrange 2 or 3 staff members from the hotel in a 7.5-ton truck with a driver, much better than driving there and back all day in a little van and all that carrying, he said. Sophie asked how much it would cost, and Jeffrey smiled and said he was sure they could work something out. Sophie thanked him and said she would check with Mike this evening and let him know. Sophie smiled to herself, thinking about how much money her arrangement was saving. What would you both like to do today? We have all afternoon, and I am feeling very indebted to you both. Brian put his hand in his pocket. Thank you for these, he said, handing them to Sophie. Sophie knew what she wanted to do. As she had been fantasizing about both men her at the same time. What about another of your stories from university or something sexy and naughty that you have never told Mike? Brian said. Jeffrey nodded in agreement, and they both pulled a kitchen chair out and sat facing Sophie. I can tell you about a bit of a lesbian experience I had. In my second year, I was in a flat shared with 2 other girls. One was a Chinese girl whose wealthy parents were funding her. She was quite studious, and her father forbade her from having any boys in the flat. She did not need to share as her parents paid the whole cost, but she wanted some company. The other girl was also quite studious and very quiet. One weekend, her mum and sister came to visit and stayed over. They borrowed my room, and I went in with Chen in a king-sized bed. I woke up in the night needing the loo to find Chen not quite spooning me, but with one hand on my boob. I got up and went to the bathroom, and when I got back in bed, I laid awake thinking about it. A few minutes later, Chen was almost spooning me again with one hand on my hip. It sounds lovely and beautiful, Jeffrey interrupted, perhaps one for another time. Have you anything a little naughtier? We had quite a few nights in bed together after that, but yes, let me think of something else. Sophie thought for a minute. What about Gay Ray? I think you called him. Jeffrey said, I can tell you about the study group that started in year 1 of politics. There was me, one huge black guy, and 3 other girls. By the start of year 2, only me and the black guy met regularly. Chen would let him come to the flat, as everyone knew him as Gay Ray, and he had no interest in girls. One study evening, I was suffering from a cramp in my feet, so Ray offered me a foot massage. I got some essential oil from the bathroom. I was wearing a long, sleepy t-shirt that came down past my knees and nothing underneath. Ray spent time massaging my feet and was good at it. He then moved up to my calves and lower legs. Sophie lifted her leg onto a chair in front of Brian and Jeffrey and ran her fingers up her shin to demonstrate. Sophie smiled and continued the story. I slouched down on the sofa and relaxed. Ray pushed the bottom of my t-shirt up to mid-thigh and carried on massaging up past my knees. I was getting turned on. I knew Ray was not interested in me, so I decided to be a little daring. He asked me to turn over and moved back as I did. No one had done that to me before. He went slowly and gently. He confessed that he had liked me for a long time but was not attracted to girls. I asked why he was so good at giving oral to girls. He told me a sort of sad tale, to be honest. He told me that when he was growing up, his two older sisters used to make him do it to them and would not let him stop until they were satisfied. He also said they would never pleasure him or let him pleasure himself while they were there. Sophie sat back down, opposite the two men, and smiled. "I've never done anything like that," Brian said. "It was never a thing that I even knew about in my youth." "Don't you believe it?" Jeffrey said quickly. "It has always been a thing. In Greece, it was quite popular to prevent babies. Do you want to come up to the bedroom? I'm changing the sheets later, so we will be comfortable and safe." Sophie led the men to the stairs and walked slowly up ahead of them. She knew they could see up under her skirt. In the bedroom, she helped both men. She hoped her plan for them would work today. Sophie stood, both men soon joined her. Sophie looked around at Jeffrey and smiled as she said, "Look in the bedside drawer, at the top." Jeffrey pulled the drawer open and saw the bottle of lube Sophie had hidden there earlier. Jeffrey needed no second bidding or encouragement. Today, she had them both at the same time, which thrilled her hugely. Brian pushed himself fully inside and held still, asking if Sophie was okay. "Mr. Wilson and Jeffrey have offered help with a van for the move," Sophie said, hearing them talking on the stairs. "They asked to have a quick look and see if a bigger van or truck would be better." A moment later, the two men appeared on the stairs. Brian looked quite red in the face. Jeffrey took over and bluffed his way through sizing a truck. They shook hands with Mike and left with Brian, thanking her for the rent and confirming they were all up to date. Sophie still had the rent money envelope in the kitchen drawer and smiled to herself. She was also relieved that Mike had not come home 10 minutes earlier and caught them all upstairs. "It's kind of Jeffrey to offer to help. I can't get the work van for another couple of weeks, and the move weekend is the playoffs, and no one wants to commit to helping for the day. I don't think we would be able to move by the month's end without his help. Do we know how much it will cost?" Sophie said he had offered that if they could just cover the cost of fuel and the wages of the men for the time they were there, that would be good. Sophie said he didn't think it would even be a couple of hundred. Mike went off to change and called down to ask what the mark on the mattress was. Sophie called back up, saying that she had spilled a half cup of coffee while bundling up the washing and had tried to mop it. She told him to leave it to dry, and she would deal with it later. Sophie's heart was banging in her chest, and she could feel her face blushing at the close call.
I rang the doorbell and stepped back to wait for my host. I put my arms around my darling Heather and pulled her to me for a quick kiss. Oh, how I loved this woman. She had given me 4 of the happiest years of my life. We were going out again to celebrate our free evening with my best friend Doug Beavers. This time, we attended a New Year's Eve party at his mansion. I was looking forward to seeing Doug, but even more, I was looking forward to spending this evening and night with my wife and celebrating the New Year in style. And I was about to ring the bell when finally Doug opened the door for us. He grinned and very loudly invited us inside. I had already realized by the number of cars parked outside and in the yard that the party was going to be very big, but I was still shocked by the number of people in his house. Doug reached over to Heather and hugged her tightly, then kissed her gently on the cheek before pulling her into the house. Turning to her, he shook my hand and stepped aside again so I could enter. The maid took our coats and disappeared with them. Doug walked between us and said, Gosh, it's so good to see you two. I really don't like my parties to get this big, but I feel like I should invite everyone. I either have business or social obligations to everyone on my list, except for a few good friends like you two. Clarissa is somewhere nearby, probably dodging the hands of lechers as usual. The evening went on. Heather and I danced, ate, and drank far more than we should have. We didn't bother because we knew we had a bed upstairs for when we needed it. We were one of the few couples invited to spend the night, so we didn't have to drive drunk, hail a cab, or have one of us stay sober and act as the designated driver. I'm moderately successful in the investment business. Heck, I'm one of the top-selling brokers in my office and in the top quarter of brokers in the entire company. So I knew many of the people in the room. I was in agreement with Doug. Many of them were lowlifes or worse. My Heather was a very beautiful woman and had to fend off advances, as did his Clarissa. As the evening progressed, I took the opportunity to network. I said hello to current clients and made an offer to some of the people in the room, trying to attract new clients. As the evening progressed, I kept my eyes on Heather. I trusted her completely, but I had to admit I was still a little jealous. I kept a constant eye on her and occasionally took it upon myself to rescue her from men who I thought were trying to be more than just charming conversationalists. Every time I'd had to rescue her at previous parties, I'd gotten a smile and a tender kiss from Heather, usually accompanied by a quiet "thank you" or "thanks for saving me, honey" on her part. This evening was no exception. Many times I approached when I saw her trying to break free from the male and pull her away. I would get her gentle touch and smile, followed by a hug or a kiss on the cheek and a quiet "thank you." We talked for a while, danced or had a drink, and went our separate ways again. As the evening progressed, many people left, leaving only those who intended to celebrate the new year with our host. I began to notice that one particular man was following Heather, almost stalking her. He never took a step away from her and watched her constantly. I recognized the look in his eyes. He was hooked on her, completely in love with her, and took every opportunity to get his way. At first, Heather ignored him or even walked away. But as the evening progressed, she began to linger around him, even smiling or laughing when he spoke. Sometimes she would gently touch his forearm. It wasn't like my Heather. She never flirted that long with any of the men who approached her, especially a stranger. Doug saw me watching them just before midnight and approached me. He said, "That's Jonathan Douglas with Heather. He's a real asshole, a deluxe ladies' man. I didn't even invite him, but one of the ladies I invited brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug stood beside me and looked around the room carefully. A curious expression appeared on his face. Then he continued, "In fact, it seems to me that Douglas's companion has already left. Tonight she watched him follow Heather around for a few minutes, and then I saw them having a rather animated conversation. I haven't seen her since. He's nothing but trouble, Stan. Trouble with a capital T. He's married, but they're more likely to live apart than together. He preys on married women or women who have something he wants. He usually goes after married pussies and single women with money that he thinks he can get his hands on. I don't know why. Hell, he's worth millions on his own. You should watch him. He might talk a nun into having fun with him and make her think it was her idea, and she loves him forever." For the third time that evening, I walked over to separate Heather and Jonathan. He glared at me, as he had on most previous occasions when I had separated him from Heather, and made a condescending remark as I walked away with her. Heather didn't thank me this time. She threw me a frustrated look and said, "Stan, what happened to you today? You could have told me that it was a pleasure chatting with Jonathan. Why did you see fit to separate us? He's not like most of the lechers you saved me from. He's a very interesting guy and he has the funniest stories. He's running for mayor and he was telling me about the people he has to deal with while campaigning. When he found out that I work in my company's public information and advertising department, he started asking me questions about how to better get his message out to voters. I think he might offer me a job, honey. I really need to communicate with him more. Just think what could happen if I could get a position in his administration." I don't care, Heather. I don't trust that asshole, and I don't like having him around you. Doug says he's nothing but trouble. He's a real womanizer. I've heard really bad things about him too, and I want you to be safe. From what I hear, the position he's bringing you in for will require you to work on your back. Heather stared at me for a moment. I saw anger flash across her face and was afraid I'd messed up, but then she smiled. Leaning over to kiss my face, she said, "Ooh, that's so sweet. I actually think you're jealous." "Well, you have nothing to worry about, sweetie. You're all mine." We had already separated again in a whirlwind of chatting when I realized that she had said that I was all hers, not that she was all mine. When that thought hit me, I paused for a moment and wondered if I had said too much or if she was trying to tell me something subconsciously. 3 months later, I had reason to remember that night in painful detail. The last 2 months had been turbulent in my house. Shortly after the party, Heather started coming home late from her meetings or visits with her parents. When I would ask her about her tardiness, she would get angry and defensive, saying she had either lost track of time or needed to finish a project or something before she could leave. She also started volunteering at the local Republican Party after work, and that was taking up her time. Heather is the manager of her section, and her skills in that area are almost legendary. She became a volunteer office manager for the local campaign headquarters and advised on informational initiatives. From what little I've heard, it appears that she eliminated chaos and became a very popular volunteer. Like many cuckolded husbands who don't know cuckolds, when she began to leave our home more often, I began to notice that our sex life was suffering. I started getting rejected more often. Oh, she always had a reason, like she was tired, or it was too late, or we didn't have time, but the fact remained. One day I was talking to Doug about the recent problems in my marriage. He cast a concerned look at me. Finally, he said, "Stan, I'm getting worried. I may be the reason your marriage has gone down the drain." For the past few weeks, I've heard that Jonathan has found himself another married whore. Rumor has it that he met her at a New Year's Eve party, and we both know where he was and who he spent most of the evening with on New Year's Eve. Allegedly, she is also a volunteer in his campaign for mayor. I felt dizzy, and my breath hitched for a moment. Doug looked at me and continued talking. He said, "Stan, what's the matter? You went white as a sheet all at once." I sat looking at Doug, then said, "Heather started volunteering for the Republican Party at their office about an hour after work and on Saturdays. She always gets home late and refuses to talk about what she does. It seems that whenever I bring it up, she gets defensive and angry. The last few nights she gets angry if I approach her." Doug leaned back in his chair and pressed his lips together for a moment, then said, "Stan, I'm going to find out what's going on, and if... No, let's just say I intend to make him pay if he abuses my hospitality by starting an affair with my best friend's wife. I'd be pissed if he picked up any married woman at one of my parties, but abusing my hospitality by stealing your wife is even worse. I should have made him leave when his companion left, but I was too concerned with being a good host. If I have caused you trouble, my friend, I promise to make it up to the best of my ability." I suppose I should tell you a little more about Doug. He's my best friend. I'd trust him with my life. Hell, I'd trust him to room with my wife. He would never do anything to hurt me. We were closer than brothers. Doug is smart, probably much smarter than anyone I've ever met. We were both in the same class in high school. He was valedictorian, and I was barely in the top 10 in our class of 223. He took 1 year of college and decided it was a waste of time. He never had to study, missed almost every class, but still had a 4.0 grade point average. In the end, he just took a couple finance courses and then started teaching himself everything he needed to know about investing and finance. Of course, the reason he needed to learn about business and finance was because during his freshman year of college, he inherited a little over $70,000 when his grandparents passed away. Unlike most young people, once he received the money, he didn't squander it. He bought a better used pickup truck and invested the rest of the money in the stock market. He bought his first 2 stocks on the recommendation of a broker. Of course, they were taste and color, and the only people who made money on them were the broker and the brokerage firm. This made Doug very angry, and he began to study. He watched CNBC, read, and researched. He decided to open an account at a discount brokerage firm. He transferred all of his net worth into that account and started investing on his own. From the very first trade Doug made on his own, he started making money. Much more than he did with the help of so-called experts. Of course, it didn't hurt that he started investing in the late 1980s, during the tech boom and dot-com craze. He got in and out of many stocks that were in great flux. No, he didn't make money on all of his purchases, but he managed to grow his capital exponentially. He had the good sense to get out when things got tough. He moved his investments into safer, more popular stocks and rode the market up with them. He bought Berkshire Hathaway at just over $17,000 per share and sold it when it reached $72,357 per share 3 years later. By then, he was a multi-millionaire and was in business with other people, either in venture capital mode or in other investments including real estate. I graduated from college and worked as a salesman for a restaurant chain for 4 years. I didn't like traveling and got serious about Heather, so I became a stockbroker. I managed a small portion of Doug's millions. He had given me some of his investments to manage when I started in the business. I suspected he did it to help a friend and felt guilty for doing so. I knew he didn't need me to advise and manage part of his portfolio and felt it was charitable. He convinced me that he needed me. His reasoning was twofold. First, he wanted some of his investments to be at different brokerages for safety. Second, he felt that someone in the business might find out about good deals or bad information about some of his companies before he did. No, neither of us thought for a second about what might be considered insider trading. But still, from time to time I found pearls of wisdom to share with him. We both prospered. He sent me many of his friends or acquaintances if they wanted to utilize the services of a full-service broker. I made money making deals for them. Doug didn't work outside the home. He worked 8 to 10 hours a day and very hard, but only for himself. He studied stocks, traded, and lived large on his own. He tried to involve Heather and me completely in his circle. We went with him to many charity events at his expense. Of course, I paid the bills for some of the events from time to time because I also had an expense account as a broker. We went with Doug to political meetings and talked to some of the most influential people in our neighborhood. I think we attended every party Doug threw at his house. Friday night after Doug and I talked, we got to go to a political rally with Doug and his lady for $500 a plate. Once again, he treated Heather and me to a meal. This time, for some reason, Heather was even more reluctant to go with us than usual. I'm afraid I insisted she come with me, and to this day I regret doing so. I suppose the train wreck our marriage was hurtling toward would have happened as soon as Doug's investigators watching Heather made their report, but at least I would have remained in the dark for a while longer. That dinner, however, was the beginning of the end for us. When we arrived, I saw that we had gotten into a dinner where the incumbent candidate for state senate was scheduled to speak in support of other state and local candidates. The money paid for the tickets went to the state Republican Party, although some of it was supposed to go to support local politicians. What I didn't know was that the guest of honor was to be a candidate for mayor of our fair city. Of course, it was none other than Jonathan "Asshole" Douglas. As we walked in, I saw Jonathan standing at the front of the room, smiling and chatting with several dignitaries. I felt Heather pull away slightly and turned around to see what was bothering her. She was standing there looking at Jonathan. Her face was shining like a woman in love. It was then that I suspected I had lost my wife. I said, "What?" I saw Heather flinch slightly and then smile weakly at me. "I'm sorry, honey. I just didn't realize who this dinner was for." She looked so guilty that I wondered if it was true, but didn't say anything. She must have known Jonathan would be there, since she worked part-time at campaign headquarters. Now I understand why she was so resistant when I insisted we come. I looked over at Doug and saw that he was watching our little conversation. He turned and looked at Jonathan, then smiled and put his hand on Heather's back. He led her over to a chair and pulled it out, helping her sit down. He then sat Clarissa down in the chair that was to his left. As I walked past him, he said, "I'm sorry, Stan. I didn't realize he was one of the recipients of our bounty when I invited you." I saw her face, Bud. "I hope I'm wrong, but I have an appointment on Monday with a friend I'd like you to meet. Can we have lunch? Say, 11:30? Finished with her meal, Heather excused herself to the restroom. I noticed that as she left the table, Jonathan got up and left the room through another door. I thought for a moment, and then started to get up and follow him. Doug put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No, Stan. It's all taken care of, and if it's her, it'll be too late anyway. Just wait until Monday. Please?" Later that night, I lost sight of Heather again, and after returning from the restroom, I went in search of her. I managed to find my way to the stage and backstage. I heard moans and soft, gentle voices. One of them I recognized immediately. It was Heather's voice. I felt an instant rush of anger and started walking towards the voices. I tripped over a rope and made a noise. I heard Heather's voice. "Oh, someone's coming. I have to get out of here, honey. It won't do either of us any good if we get caught now. I'll see you at the office. I love you." I heard a quick slap, as if she'd given me a quick kiss, and then quick footsteps moving away on the other side of the stage. I followed her, but was too late to catch what I assumed was my cheating wife and Jonathan. I was slowly making my way back the way I had come when I ran into Doug in the hallway. His face was like a storm cloud. He grabbed me and made me stop and look at him. He said, "Damn it, Stan! I told you to leave it alone. My men need to gather information for you before you do something stupid. If she really is cheating on you, and I believe she is, we need information. Proof. So we can plan and get back at that asshole properly, and so you can get a better deal in the divorce if that's what you want. The way you're trying to do it, the only thing you're going to accomplish is getting hammered by the court system." After he calmed me down a bit, Doug continued. "I saw them rushing down another hallway. They stopped at the door to the hall and she looked around, trying to find you. Not seeing you, she got scared and told him she thought it was you wandering around trying to find them. Now you've got a suspicious crook on your hands, and you'll have a harder time coming out on him." When we got back to the table, we made a spectacle of ourselves. We made sure Heather and a few others saw us laughing and passing each other a pocket flask. Heather looked at me as I took the seat next to her and asked where we were. At this time, Clarissa walked over to Doug and gave him a hug. She smiled at us and said, "Okay, you two. Next time I catch you sneaking out to your car to get a drink, I'm either going to go with you or turn you into the police. Now pour me out of this flask." We watched as Heather relaxed a little and then turned to Clarissa and asked, "Oh my God. Is that what those two were doing? I was wondering where they were when I couldn't find them." Clarissa laughed and replied, "Oh yes, I was trying to get to them to get my share before they went inside. But as you can see, they beat me to it." Later, during the dance, I took my turn with Clarissa. She snuggled up to me, and once when I tried to turn around to look around the room behind me, she refused to follow suit. She kissed me gently on the cheek and said, "No, Stan, you really don't want to look there. Just dance with me and try to enjoy the evening. I know what you're going through right now, and trust me, it's only going to get worse from here. Just remember that Doug and I are by your side and always will be." I relaxed a little and gently kissed her back. "Thanks for helping with the conversation. I almost snapped, and Doug seems to think that would be a really bad thing. I want to rip that asshole apart so badly I don't know what to do." The rest of the week and weekend were hard on me. I was alternately scared and angry. In the back of my mind, I realized that Heather had left me emotionally, and that it was only a matter of time before she left me physically. For weeks now, we hadn't been a happy couple. I began to mentally distance myself from her, even though I wasn't sure if she was cheating. If she wasn't cheating, then we had some other problem because we just weren't as loving a couple as we used to be. Finally came my meeting with Doug and his friend. I was pretty sure his friend would turn out to be a private investigator. I was nervous and felt my stomach cramping. He was upset and sour with acid. I could feel my anger boiling deep inside, and I knew the other two men could see it. I was terrified of what I thought I might find out, and at the same time, I couldn't wait to find out. Doug stood up as I approached the table, shook my hand, and gave me a hug. After the greeting, he introduced me to his friend Simon Hobbs, who happened to be an investigator. We sat for a minute studying the menu to order our food. The waitress jumped up and took our order, whereupon Doug said, "Why don't we get the unpleasant business out of the way first?" He looked at his other guest, then at me. The private investigator reached into his briefcase and pulled out a large envelope from there. He held it out to me and said, "We've been following your wife and Mr. Douglas at the behest of Mr. Beavers. The surveillance continued for 20 days from the time we were hired until last Saturday evening. During that time, we found that they dined together daily, except on Sunday, when she seemed always to stay home. Their lunches were scattered about the city, but always took place at good hotels, after which they went to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 different occasions, we managed to get into the room by posing as a room service waiter. In all 8 cases, the bed was used. Photographs of the room and subjects are included in the report. We also made an audio recording of each encounter by placing a microphone under the door of the room. The subjects entertained themselves on each hotel visit during our surveillance. Many days we documented inappropriate contact at or after the campaign headquarters. We have photos of subjects doing this 3 times at the campaign headquarters, and once when they attended a party at a local bar with friends and supporters of Mr. Douglas. Perhaps the best, or at least the most damaging thing we came across was when Mr. Douglas used your wife to get the support of the Municipal Employees Union. They met with Union President Stephen Negrano at the Gentlemen's Club. He seemed to be very attracted to your wife. We have photos of her sitting on his lap. My operative was able to get close enough to record the conversation. Listen to this portion of the recording, and then we'll continue. Simon placed a small laptop on the table and began playing the snippet from the DVD. He said, "You will receive a copy of this DVD in your report, but I wanted to discuss this incident with you before we cut our meeting short. My operative was very excited about this information, and I think your attorney will be as well." Doug and I leaned forward and watched and listened to the ensuing segment. During the session, Heather was sitting between Jonathan and Stephen. Both men leaned over her to talk, and Jonathan's hands were wandering. We could hear Heather asking him to stop, but he told her, "Now, Heather, I feel, and you know how much you like what we're doing. Just relax and go with the flow. It's not like there isn't something like that going on in this club." When he stopped talking, Jonathan leaned over to Heather and kissed her. Stephen looked at Jonathan and said, "Jonathan, I think you know what you need to do to get the union's approval. I want to spend the weekend with this lady. If I get that, I'll be sure the union will support your candidacy." Heather tensed and tried to rise, hissing, "No, that will never happen. Now let me go." Stephen only looked at Jonathan and raised his eyebrows. Jonathan swallowed and leaned over to Heather. He said, "Honey, we really need that approval. Please just go with it and help me with this. It will help secure our future, and besides, it's not like you've never made love before. Just tell your asshole husband you have a meeting this weekend." In the video, Heather looked shocked and resisted for a moment longer, and then we saw her relax. We saw her cheating. About this time, the club manager approached the table. He looked at Heather, then at the men on either side of her. He looked nervous and stuttered as he spoke, "Please, Mr. Negrano, there's a lot I haven't done for you, but I've been informed that you and the boys have become too conspicuous. Lieutenant Jones told me that the chief has asked some of his detectives to come to the club and try to stop displays like you and the lady. If they catch us doing stuff like that, they'll lock me up. Could you take this to one of the back rooms or the hotel? Please, sir? This business is all I do for a living." Stephen laughed and looked at one of the large men on the other side of the table. He said, "Hey, Ralph, would you toss Joe a couple thousand for his trouble? Me and the little lady are going to the DoubleTree for the weekend. Organize it for me, will you? Organize it like a union leadership meeting like we usually do." I felt myself getting even more upset and started to rise. I growled, "That lying bitch? She wasn't here last weekend. She called me Friday night and told me she had been assigned an urgent damage repair project for her employer, and was flying out to San Francisco. Doug and Simon grabbed me and pulled me back to my seat. Simon said, "Please hold on, sir. I want to fast forward and show you one more clip, and then we'll let you read the report yourself. We have some ideas about this that I wanted to talk to you about, but I thought you might want to watch the DVD before we discuss them." Now my operatives stopped filming at the club and called for backup. My operatives managed to get ahead of Stanley and made their way to the Doubletree Hotel. After the thugs checked him into the hotel, he and Heather went to the bar for a few drinks. My operatives followed the thugs to the suite in the hotel uniforms we had purchased. When they opened the door, my men followed them. After the thugs finished checking out the suite, my men began arranging pillows, flowers, and other decorations. Simon smiled and continued. The older man even sent his assistant to get fresh flowers and champagne so they would have an excuse to wander around the suite longer. We managed to set up some cameras and microphones in the main room and 2 bedrooms. By the time your wife and Stanley returned to the room, they were both intoxicated. The cameras captured that footage, among other things. Simon started playing the DVD on his small computer again. Heather and Stanley went into the room and closed the door. Next, they went into the bedroom and got on with it. After that, Simon turned off the computer. He looked at me and said, "Your wife stayed in the hotel room until checkout on Monday. During that time, she had fun with all the senior managers of the Municipal Employees Union, as well as Stephen. We heard about plans to use union money and union workers' salaries to support Jonathan in the mayoral election. Late Saturday night, Jonathan visited the room and he, the director, and Stephen entertained Heather almost all night. We have pictures of this, as well as footage of them planning to misuse city funds if Jonathan is elected. We also have pictures of Senator Nussbaum and 2 judges having fun with your wife and Jonathan Douglas. Records show that he traded her favors for their endorsement." The investigator looked at me for a moment before continuing. He said, "During your attempt to catch your wife and Mr. Douglas at the election dinner, they were about to do it on stage. He was just starting to do it when she heard you and made him stop. That's when they ran away from you. We have pictures of what happened there. It would have been better if you hadn't intervened. Pictures of the action in that place would have been very damaging. We were going to shoot with the crowd in the background. At least you didn't get caught and make a scene that would have further damaged your efforts to end things on a favorable note for you. We have provided you with a copy of the entire case, sir, and will provide it to your attorney if you wish. Our investigation fees will cover any testimony in court if required. However, I would recommend continued surveillance for possible criminal prosecution. I know this is usually handled by the police, but if we provide them and the FBI with documentation of misuse of campaign funds and conspiracy, they will take our charges more seriously. Besides, if you file for divorce and your wife ends up in jail, you'll get a better settlement." Even knowing this was going to happen, I have to admit that I was upset and shocked. I couldn't believe the depth of disrespect my wife had shown during the time she was under supervision. Documents showed that she thought she was in love with Jonathan. They were actively discussing how and when she would leave me. She talked excitedly about the position she had been promised in Jonathan's administration if he was elected mayor. Perhaps what shocked me the most was her willingness to spend the weekend at the Doubletree and the activities she did there for her lover and his friends. I always knew Heather was driven to succeed in her career and admired by powerful people, but I just couldn't believe that she was willing to go to any lengths to get her way. I became almost physically ill. I had hardly eaten anything, and I noticed that Doug hadn't either. After the investigator left, we had a few drinks each. We were both quiet for a while in thought before Doug said to me, "Stan, I'm sorry I ruined your marriage. I hold myself completely responsible for your troubles, and I intend to make it up to you. I know I can't undo what I've allowed to happen, but I intend to do the best I can. I will find you a good lawyer if, no, nothing, for the divorce. I'll give you any other support you need until you're back to the way you were before, as much as possible." I pushed away from the table and looked at Doug. I said, "Well, get busy finding a lawyer." I was almost ready to give her an ultimatum. Either she would stop acting like this, or we would divorce before I knew for sure she was cheating. Now there's no way I'm leaving that bitch. Oh my God, I can't believe she did those things. I wonder when she changed, or did I just never know what kind of woman she really was? As for the other thing, you know as well as I do that Heather's cheating wasn't your fault, and you don't owe me anything because of it. On Thursday, Doug called me and said, "Hey, my friend, I found you an absolute shark among lawyers. She passionately hates cheaters and always sides with the innocent party in a divorce case. She has a real hatred for public personas and businessmen who use their status and position to cheat on women. If you play this outright, you can not only dump Heather and keep most of your assets, but you can also get your pound of flesh from Jonathan." Doug gave me the name and phone number of a lawyer he recommended. I called her in the afternoon to arrange a consultation. When I told her assistant who I was, she replied that they were expecting my call. She also said they had an appointment for the next morning at 9 a.m. if I could make it. I agreed to the appointment time and was given a list of things I needed to bring and information to have with me for my first appointment. When I arrived the next morning, I was immediately ushered into the office. My new attorney impressed me, and we quickly moved into a friendly conversation about my desires and aspirations for my upcoming divorce proceedings. I told my new attorney, Sally, "I want to get out of this marriage with all of my assets. I know I probably won't get them, but that's what I want. I want to sue the bastard who stole my wife for everything I can get my hands on. I want him to lose the mayoral election and be penniless." Sally smiled and leaned back in her chair. She rocked it slightly from side to side, pondering. Finally, she smiled and asked, "Do you really want to do this, or do you want to destroy him financially, take away his election and his good name, and send him to prison? We can almost certainly get him jail time if we do it right. I've already read part of the private investigator's report, and it's good. I'm sorry. I know how bad it is for you and your marriage, but the information it contains is so flawed that we can crucify most of the protagonists in this little mess. Furthermore, I am obligated to turn the investigator's report over to the authorities because they violated several federal laws. If you let me do that first and then file for divorce, we can deal him a more painful blow. If you file first, he can run and evade capture for a while. I don't care what we do to him and the other assholes who did this to Heather, just as long as it hurts and hurts a lot. I know Heather is guilty of all of this. From what I saw when he first met her, he was the aggressor. He stalked her until she succumbed to his charms and climbed into his bed. It takes two to tango, you know. She always wore rings, so he knew she was married. In fact, I heard them talking on tapes about her stupid husband and planning what to do to me when it was time for the big breakup. Sally and I worked through all of her issues, and I made a decision. I told her to prepare and file divorce papers immediately. Sally and I also agreed that the private investigator's report should be immediately turned over to the FBI so they could begin investigating campaign law violations and misuse of union and city funds and positions. Sally suggested that I go with the bailiff when Heather was served with the subpoena and threatened to sue Mr. Douglas. She said, "If he operates the way most politicians and powerful people do, he will either threaten you with physical harm, fire you from your job, or threaten a countersuit. If you hold firm, I expect him to offer to secretly negotiate with you to pay you off. In that case, depending on where he gets the money, we could prosecute him for even more campaign law violations. As sleazy as many people in public office are, I expect him to try to divert campaign funds to pay you off." Sally reached into her desk drawer and handed me a small microphone and recorder. She said, "I want you to carry this with you at all times and keep it on. Hide the microphone in your hair and the recorder in your car. The range of the transmitter is about half a mile. If your car is out of range of the transmitter, this little microphone can record up to 6 hours of conversation. The device will download any saved recordings as soon as you are within range of your car. If you give me the keys, I'll have someone set up the recorder in your car while we finish up here. I also suggest that you either rehire your private investigator or let me find one for you to continue monitoring your wife and Mr. Douglas. It has come to my attention that Mrs. Malone is not the first wife he has seduced, and when he was caught, he tried to use illegal means to cover up the problem. If we have a plan and suggestions on tape this time, we can really mess with him and your wife." I smiled and said, "The detective made the same recommendation. I'm still holding him in reserve." The following Thursday morning, Sally called me and said, "Mr. Malone, we are ready to file the divorce papers and serve them on your wife. Do you still want to stick to our plan and attend the filing and make your comments?" "Oh, yes. If anything, I might get a little pleasure out of being present. I've been thinking about the service too. Don't you think it would be a good idea to serve her this Friday night at campaign headquarters?" Sally was silent for a moment, then said, "No, Stan, I'm afraid I think that would be a very bad idea. If you serve her there and make the remarks you plan to make, everyone at campaign headquarters in the office will either hear you or know about your threats almost immediately. If that happens, every newspaper will write about it tomorrow, and the good and honorable Mr. Douglas will be backed into a corner. He may lose the election, but he'll have no incentive to threaten you or try to bribe you. I suggest you postpone applying to her until she is alone or with him alone." "Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. Why don't we just follow them and see if they go out alone tomorrow night? Heather doesn't usually get home until almost midnight on Fridays. I think the private investigator's report said that they usually spend some time alone in a hotel room on Friday night, usually the same one they used on Friday at noon. Can we just serve them a summons in their room and possibly catch them in the act?" Sally agreed to have the bailiff, and I interrupt their rendezvous in the hotel room Friday night. When I entered my office, there were two men in suits waiting for me. They introduced themselves and said they wanted to discuss how I would handle some funds for their widowed mother. I smiled and invited them into my office. After I closed the door, they approached me and showed me their identification. They were from the FBI and wanted to discuss my interest in Jonathan. They were working on a case based on the material my attorney had already handed over. When the two gentlemen learned that I intended to go with the bailiff and record the procedure, they also asked me to wear one of their devices to record the conversation. This request alarmed me, as I wondered how this would affect my plans to get some questionable money from Jonathan, my payoff, if you will. But I couldn't think of a good reason to turn them down, so I agreed to wear their wire. That night, we all followed the two oblivious lovebirds from campaign headquarters to the hotel. They left headquarters at 7 p.m. and were in the room by 7:30. There were so many of us that it was like a convoy. I was even afraid we would be identified. After they got to the hotel, we gave them almost an hour of time. I had thoughtfully brought my camera with me to capture this stretch of time for posterity. I'm not usually interested in home movies, but in this case, I made an exception. We were just getting ready to knock on the door when we received a gift from God. We heard the elevator door open, and out stepped a waiter carrying a cart of dishes. He walked up to the room and looked at us with a questioning expression on his face. I smiled and pointed to the door and then said, "Come in, be our guests." We didn't realize we were interrupting Mr. Douglas's dinner. We'll be right back. The waiter smiled and said, "Okay, no problem." He knocked on the door, and when the asshole asked who it was, he said, "Room service." The door opened and our friendly waiter entered the room. The process server and I stood back and waited for the waiter to leave. When he opened the door to leave, I moved over so it wouldn't close. The process server and I then quietly entered the room. We stood in front of the door for a moment so we couldn't see the two crooks. We waited until Jonathan and Heather started dinner before we fully entered the room and saw them. When we entered the room, I was a little ahead of them. I was shocked, appalled, and heartbroken at what I saw. I know I shouldn't have done that since I saw the private investigator's report, but I was shocked. There is something different about seeing the tape and seeing it in real life. From the looks on both of their faces, they were in seventh heaven. Finally, I nodded to the server, and he walked into the room. He asked, "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather shrieked. Jonathan let out an oath and angrily stood up. He growled, "Yes, asshole, you are, and I advise you to get out of my hotel room immediately. How did you even get in here?" "Well, sir, your room service waiter let us in as he was leaving. Didn't you hear us ask if we could come in?" "I was sure you had invited us in." The server walked further into the room and handed Heather the divorce papers. He said, "You have been served." I walked further into the room and Heather finally saw me. She said, "Stan, damn you. What are you doing here and what is this divorce? If you don't call off this madness, you'll have nothing, I'll have everything." No, Heather, you won't do any of that. In fact, if you know what's good for you, you'll just sign the papers and accept the agreement I've offered. When I'm done with you, I'm going to get my pound of flesh from this lover. I'm going to sue him and his campaign for mental abuse and alienation of affection. I'm lucky we live in one of the states that still allows such lawsuits. Of course, as a bonus, this could affect the election. Roughly speaking, you've been screwed, and now you're going to get screwed big time. Heather didn't even try to go home that night. In fact, I didn't see or hear from her until the following Wednesday when she called me at work. She didn't even try to apologize or make small talk. When I picked up the phone, she started talking. She said, "Jonathan and I want to meet with you about this mess. We have reserved a meeting room at the Doubletree Hotel for this evening. We want to get this mess over with so we can move on. We look forward to seeing you at 7. I received no response. I wasn't asked if I could make it to the meeting. I was simply told to show up. I called Sally and told her about the phone call, then called my contact at the FBI. Sally told me to be sure to attend the meeting, as did the FBI. Sally said she would be there with me. The FBI also said there would be people around to help if there were any difficulties. Arriving at the hotel, I asked where my meeting would be held. The receptionist directed me down the hall to the smallest of the meeting rooms. When I arrived, there was a very large man standing at the door. I started to walk in, but he stopped me. "There is a private meeting going on in this room, sir." "Yes, I know. I'm Stan Malone, and I'm supposed to be there." After checking my ID, he knocked on the door. It opened slightly, and he said, "Mr. Malone is here, sir." I didn't hear what was said, but the door closed. The guard turned to me and said, "I must search you, sir. Would you mind turning your pockets out into the tray?" After I turned my pockets out, they started searching me. I started to get angry and demanded an explanation as to why I was being searched. The thug grinned and said, "Well, sir, people have been known to try to take down political figures, and Mr. Douglas doesn't want to take any chances." I strongly suspected that I was being searched for a tape recorder or wiretap, but I didn't bother to ask. My hair was quite long, and the little transmitters I carried were hidden in it, glued to my scalp. After the search, it took almost 5 minutes before the door opened, and I was allowed to enter the meeting room. When I entered the room, I saw Heather sitting at the table looking at me. She looked very guilty, her face flushed a lot. I felt anger boil up in me at the realization of what she had probably done. I looked at Jonathan and almost lost control of myself. His eyes were sparkling and he was smirking. I knew he was gloating about the fact that he had just entertained my wife. The meeting went as Sally and I had envisioned. Jonathan threatened me first with termination from my job and then with bodily harm if I didn't give Heather a better settlement offer and drop my stated plans to file lawsuits against him and his campaign. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Listen to me, mister. I know you and your friends will manage to get to me, possibly injure or kill me, but that won't save you. I have taken every precaution and have prepared several packages to mail if anything should happen to me or my family. Even if I am injured in an accident, these packages will be mailed. You know as well as I do that it is impossible to control all the media in this country. Some of them will be published, especially if I am seriously injured or die. You will go down." I saw the anger flash across Jonathan's face and noticed him tense up, which I had realized years ago meant Heather was furious. I smiled at them and continued talking. "I know what you did right before I came here, and I have pictures of you doing it several more times. Hell, I even have pictures and tapes of your meeting last week at Doubletree with the union and high-ranking members of the city administration. Do you really think all these gentlemen will thank you for dragging them along? I assure you, if anything were to happen to me, the documents that will be mailed out will have information about them, my wife and you. We both know that many of them are connected to, shall we say, dangerous people. Heather stared daggers at me, and Jonathan looked a little ill at ease, I thought. He tried to turn pale and said, "You heard what I said. Drop your threats and do things quietly or else. Now get your ass out of here. I've had my say." I smiled and stood up. I looked Jonathan in the eye until he started to get worried. I could see that all he could do was keep looking at me. I laughed and turned to go to the door. As I opened the door, I stopped again and said, "You know, Jonathan, I might change my mind if I was guaranteed very fair compensation from my wife in the divorce. Hell, if the idiots in this town decided to elect you, they deserve what they get." I immediately headed home, and when I got there, I found my private investigator friend already waiting for me. He and an FBI agent were visiting. They had both removed and secured their microphones. My private investigator said, "We got all of this as well as Jonathan's conversation with your wife and his friends after you left. He put a tail on you with orders to keep an eye on you and report back to him if they find anything bad about you. You're really bothering him." I waited 3 days and then made sure my tail from Jonathan was by my side when I called my lawyer. First, we discussed the divorce, and then wrapping up the conversation, I said, "Sally, I'm tired of waiting for that asshole. I've told him and Heather what it's going to take to get me to leave, and so far they're both balking. Get the papers ready and file a lawsuit against Jonathan. I think we should go for a higher amount. Let's ask for $10 million. That should get his attention and splash all over the news." I laughed to myself as I saw the thug chasing me fall behind and grab my cell phone. I watched him talk and gesticulate. I got in my car and drove straight home. That night, I still hadn't had time to eat dinner when I got a call from Jonathan. He never admitted that his man had heard me tell Sally to sue. He said, "Listen, asshole. Heather and I discussed our meeting and decided to give you part of what you asked for. She will sign the divorce papers you gave her with no changes. She will leave your marriage with only her personal assets and pension from her job. I have decided to enter into an out-of-court, voluntary agreement with you if you assure me that nothing will come out of this." Well, shithead, all I can do in that regard is promise that I won't be the one to let it all out. Naturally, I can't promise that no one will let the cat out of the bag. After all, right now there are probably hundreds of people who know you're having fun with my wife. Okay, here's the deal. You sign a non-disclosure agreement and I'll put $1 million into your account, no questions asked. Heather files the divorce papers, signing a consent to the agreement you suggested. I laughed and said, "Hell, it's a small thing. I just instructed my attorney to file a $10 million personal injury lawsuit. I know I probably won't get it, but you should make well over $1 million before I drop the suit. Hell, I can make over $1 million on the book and movie rights if I sell this story." Okay. I guess I could make a little more, but not much more. How about $1.7 million? I think I can squeeze the most out of it, and no one will say too much. I'll figure out a way to show it was spent on the campaign. But that's my best offer. Okay, but we need to move on. I'm not telling my lawyer to stop working until I see the money in my bank account. Here are the numbers for the secret account in the Cayman Islands. I didn't tell him I'd opened the account in his name and used his mailing address. I hoped federal investigators would discover this and follow the trail of money from his campaign to the bank. Of course, I planned to wire the money the day it arrived, so it couldn't be returned. Later that evening, I heard my doorbell ring. When I walked over, I saw the same man who had guarded the door during my meeting with Jonathan and Heather. He looked at me and held out a clipboard with a one-page legal document on it. He said, "Mr. Douglas asked me to bring this for you to sign." I read the document, then looked up at him. I said, "It looks fine to me, but before I sign it, I have to discuss it with my lawyer." "Well, I shouldn't leave without it." I sighed and closed the door in his face. I went to my office and called Sally. When I explained to her the nature of the problem, she agreed to come to my house and go over the document. It took her almost an hour to get there, but after reading the document, she smiled and told me to sign it. 3 days later, I discovered that the account balance in the Caymans was $1,700,000. That same day, I received a call from my attorney informing me that Heather had returned the signed divorce agreement and it had been filed with the court. Since the divorce was uncontested, it should be finalized in 30 days. I had already transferred the money from my account in the Caymans in case this asshole tried to get it back. I moved it twice around the world and then deposited it in another account in another Cayman bank under another assumed name. I continued to work through these difficult times, but my production was suffering. My commissions were almost half what they normally are, and not just because of the bad economy. Many times, one of my coworkers would fill in for me and take a commission on the sales and purchases my clients made. After my divorce was finalized, I was still reeling. I was making more and more mistakes at work, and it was costing me dearly. If I bought or sold the wrong thing for a client, I had to correct the situation. I was tired of constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure there was no accident in my path. I was afraid that at some point Jonathan and his friends would decide to take a chance and hurt me for what I had done to him. I was especially worried about retaliation when the feds finally took action against all the players. And I was sitting at home one night wondering how my life could have gone to hell so quickly when the doorbell rang. It was already 9 o'clock at night. When I opened the door, I saw Heather standing there. She was crying and had a big red blotch on her face. I realized that she was going to have one hell of a bruise by morning. She looked at me, then lowered her gaze to the floor. She said, "Stan, please, can I talk to you?" I almost told her no and slammed the door in her face, but then I decided to see what could have motivated her to come to me to talk. I stepped back and invited her inside. Without saying a word, I simply led her back into the room and sat down in a chair. The security cameras were still running, and I wanted to talk where the image would be better. I guided her over to the couch so the cameras would be more comfortable filming her. Heather sat there looking at me, crying silently. Finally, she said, "Stan, I know it's too late, but I finally..." Heather took a deep breath and continued, "I want to apologize to you for what I did to us. I knew better, but somehow that bastard broke through my defenses. You know how much I love to flirt and how much I want to succeed. Somehow he knew which of my buttons to push, and I fell madly in love with him. It was like he was a perfect match for me, and I just couldn't say no to him. I was so caught up in the high-profile job he promised me after the election if I helped him that I lost sight of us." Heather was crying loudly now. She looked at me and said, "Do you know how mad I got at you on New Year's Eve when you tried to break us up? Oh, Stan, you were already too late the last time you pulled me away from Jonathan. We just got back to the room from one of Doug's bedrooms. That bastard talked me into having fun with him a little less than 3 hours after I met him. I'm so sorry. It only took 3 weeks of running around behind your back before I was convinced I had to be completely in his camp. He promised to divorce his wife and marry me after the election. He told me he couldn't file for divorce sooner because it might cost him the election. I fell in love with the idea of being married to a mayor and later perhaps a senator or governor. After the trouble you caused, I began to feel like Jonathan was distancing himself from me. This evening at the office, I caught him in the storage room with one of the young female students who were volunteering. You were right as always, Stan. He was filling her head with the same nonsense he did to me. He promised to leave his wife and marry her as soon as the election was over. I confronted them, and he laughed at me. He asked me what made me think he would marry an old, shabby whore like me, especially one who cheated on her husband. He said that if I was nice to him, he would keep me around, and I could live happily ever after as his social secretary. He laughed at me and said I could entertain some of his more important clients like I had done in the past. His new whore laughed at me and I slapped him. Then he slapped me. Stan, I know it's too late for us, but I want you to know that I finally get it, and I want to apologize for what I did to us. To you, really. Stan, if you could find it in your heart to forgive me, I would love to be together again. I knew I had a good man, but there was something about Jonathan that I couldn't resist. I got so excited at the thought of possibly living the big life with him that I lost all reason. Heather stared at me for another moment. I watched silent tears flow down her cheeks. Finally, she smiled hesitantly, stood up, and walked over to my chair. Leaning forward, Heather kissed me gently on the cheek and then ran out of the room and out of the house. I sat in shock for another moment before I walked to the door and watched her car drive away. I sighed and thought, how I wished she'd come to her senses before spreading her legs in front of that asshole and his union and government supporters. I turned and walked back into the den. After a few days, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get away from all the memories and pain. I put my house on the market and hired a real estate agent to find me another one without those memories. I hired a crew to assemble the furniture and send it to storage. I hired another crew to clean the house and another to take care of the yard. From time to time, I contacted Doug or Sally. They said the feds were keeping the investigation under wraps in case the police turned out to be corrupt as well. It was agreed not to mention my name in the investigation and not to use the information given to Sally unless absolutely necessary. Sally told me that the feds had found enough evidence of corruption and were willing to honor that agreement. Almost 6 weeks after I decided to sell my house, I woke up to a special news bulletin being shown on all the national news programs. The feds had arrested everyone involved in Heather's use of Jonathan. They were indicted on numerous charges, including misuse of funds, corruption, malfeasance in office, campaign violations, and racketeering, among others. Jonathan was arrested for misuse of campaign funds, improper acceptance of donations in excess of what is allowed by law, and selling the rights to appointive positions in his presumed future administration. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Heather was also arrested for some violations. I called Sally as soon as her office opened that morning to see if she could shed any light on the subject. All she knew at that point was that the information had been leaked by someone other than me, so it looked like Jonathan and his payoff would be clear to me. Of course, he couldn't get the money back, but if he sued me over the non-disclosure agreement, it's possible, even likely, that I would have won, because the FBI and the news service attributed to 2 campaign staffers the tips that started the investigation. I hope I wasn't suspected of denouncing union officials. I didn't need a visit from unreliable characters in the middle of the night. I smiled to myself, remembering how I tried to discreetly slip incriminating notes and documents into the piles of papers some of the workers were handling. I had done this many times when I was supposedly in the office looking for Heather. Finished talking to Sally, I leaned back in my chair and smiled. I had gotten my revenge on Jonathan and freed myself from the cheating whore at no cost other than attorney fees. In addition, Jonathan's generosity had made my life $1.7 million better. I was now able to find a decent woman to marry and start a family. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.